Midway Atoll, 4 June 1942. Just after 0400 hours. The rhythmic pulse of the ocean against the coral gave way to the distant yet unmistakable thrum of aircraft engines. This sound, a prelude to destruction, was the inciting incident that would ultimately unravel the intricate, often unappreciated, network of island spotters across the vast Pacific, exposing a fatal flaw in Japanese naval aviation doctrine. The stakes were immediate and existential. The fate of the American fleet, then still largely unaware of the approaching danger, hung precariously on the interpretation and transmission of these early warnings. On the small, windswept sand spit of Eastern Island, Seaman First Class George H. Gay, Jr., an aviation ordnance man, stood his watch in the pre-dawn gloom, his eyes scanning the eastern horizon. His primary duty was the maintenance of the island's limited anti-aircraft defenses. But every man on Midway understood the secondary, unspoken role of vigilant observation. The initial radar contact, a faint blip reported minutes earlier, had been dismissed by some as atmospheric interference, a common occurrence in the humid tropical air. Yet Gay, with his keen understanding of the nuances of radar signatures and the typical flight patterns of reconnaissance aircraft, recognized the distinct, growing signature of a large formation. The radar station's AN/CPS-1 set, a relatively new acquisition, operated on a frequency of 200 MHz, providing a maximum range of approximately 120 miles against high-altitude targets. Its operators, often newly trained, struggled with the interpretation of returns amid significant ground clutter and meteorological anomalies. Daily calibration logs, however, indicated consistent performance, and the maintenance crew, including Gay, meticulously recorded any deviations. The early morning contact, initially a single return, quickly blossomed into multiple, distinct echoes, indicating a large inbound strike force, not merely a lone scout. This raw data, transmitted by field telephone to the command center, represented the first tangible evidence of the impending attack. The system, while rudimentary by later war standards, was designed to provide a critical early warning, allowing for defensive preparations and the scrambling of interceptors. Its effectiveness, however, relied entirely on the willingness of higher command to acknowledge and act upon the information. The initial reports, detailing the approach of many planes, were met with a degree of skepticism, a cultural predisposition within some naval circles to favor visual confirmation over technological abstraction. The Japanese, for their part, relied heavily on their own air reconnaissance, but their operational doctrine placed less emphasis on the integration of disparate intelligence sources, particularly those originating from static ground observation posts. Their pilots, highly trained and confident in their aerial prowess, often viewed ground-based spotters as an auxiliary, rather than a primary, source of critical tactical information. This perceived self-sufficiency, born of early war successes, created a dangerous chasm between the frontline observers and the decision-makers at sea. The disparity in approach was stark. American forces, though often under-resourced, had begun to invest in a layered defense where every piece of information, no matter how small, was intended to contribute to the overall picture. Japanese strategy, conversely, prioritized concentrated offensive power, assuming that the sheer force of their carrier air groups would overwhelm any defenses before comprehensive intelligence could be fully utilized. This underlying philosophical difference would soon manifest in devastating practical consequences, as the warnings from isolated outposts went unheeded by those who needed them most. The morning sun, once a beacon, now cast long, unsettling shadows across the cockpit instruments. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, leading the first wave of Zero fighters, pressed the transmit button on his radio, the familiar crackle of static, the only reply. He tried again, a sharper, more insistent tone in his voice, but the airwaves remained stubbornly silent. devoid of the reassuring chatter from Akagi's flight control. This was not a training exercise. The stakes were the survival of the fleet, the very future of the Empire. Below, the vast expanse of the Pacific offered no visual cues, only the endless blue. His wingmen, equally perplexed, began to weave slightly, their formation tightening almost imperceptibly. Their radios, too, were silent. The meticulous planning, the countless hours of drills, all predicated on a constant flow of information between air and sea, now seemed to unravel with each passing moment of unresponsiveness. The doctrine of aggressive offense, honed over years, relied on the carrier as a mobile command center, directing and receiving, an extension of the pilot's will. The Japanese naval aviation system, while technically advanced in some areas, particularly in aircraft design, lagged in secure and reliable long-range radio communication for tactical operations. Their radios, often temperamental and susceptible to interference, were a known weakness, but never before had such a profound silence enveloped an entire fleet during a critical engagement. The American carriers, by contrast, employed more robust communication protocols and equipment, a detail often overlooked in the pre-war assessments focused on raw aircraft performance. Itaya scanned the horizon, his eyes straining for any sign of the Kido Butai. The last confirmed position, relayed hours earlier, placed them well within range, yet no visual contact had been made, no radio signals received. The absence of communication created a vacuum, a void where precise orders and critical intelligence should have been. This forced the pilots to rely solely on their initial mission parameters, a rigid adherence to a plan that might now be dangerously outdated. The lack of communication was not merely an inconvenience. It was a fundamental breakdown of the command structure. Without carrier direction, the returning aircraft would have no guidance for landing, no updated enemy positions, and no tactical adjustments. Each pilot became an isolated unit, forced to make decisions based on incomplete and potentially obsolete information, a stark contrast to the tightly coordinated operations envisioned by naval strategists. The fuel gauges, already dipping, served as a stark reminder of their finite endurance. The silence from the carriers was not just an absence of sound, it was an absence of support, a growing premonition of abandonment. The meticulous order of battle, once so clear, began to blur into an unsettling uncertainty. The returning strike groups, having completed their attacks on American forces, began their long, arduous journey back to what they believed would be the waiting decks of their carriers. Fuel gauges were dropping steadily, a constant, silent reminder of the finite nature of their flight. The pilots, having expended their ordnance, were now solely focused on navigation and the familiar sight of their home fleet. As the hours passed and the sun began its slow descent, an unease settled over the formations. The expected radio chatter, the reassuring voices of flight control, remained absent. Pilots adjusted their frequencies, checking and rechecking their equipment, a growing sense of bewilderment replacing their earlier combat focus. The vast expanse of the Pacific, once a familiar highway, now seemed an endless, empty void. The first pilots to reach the designated rendezvous points found nothing but empty ocean, no smoke plumes, no telltale oil slicks, no distant silhouettes of warships. Their initial confusion quickly morphed into a chilling realization. They began to fan out, desperate to locate any sign of the fleet, their eyes scanning the horizon for the familiar shapes of their carriers. The fuel situation became critical. Some pilots, in a desperate attempt to extend their range, began jettisoning external fuel tanks and even non-essential equipment, a stark admission of their predicament. The silence from their command grew deafening, each unanswered call amplifying the growing dread within their cockpits. The vastness of the ocean, once a strategic advantage, now became an unforgiving enemy. As dusk deepened into night, the situation became untenable. Pilots, some flying on fumes, were forced to make agonizing decisions. Ditching into the open ocean was a last resort, a gamble against the unforgiving elements. The sea, which had borne their carriers, now awaited their aircraft, a silent, indifferent tomb. The radio silence continued, a final, unyielding answer. The returning Zeros, their fuel gauges dropping precipitously, circled the coordinates where Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu should have been. The vast expanse of the Pacific, once a familiar canvas of imperial power, now offered only an unbroken, empty horizon. No smoke plumes, no telltale oil slicks, no reassuring radio chatter from the carrier command. The pilots, having expended their ordnance and fought through the American interceptors, expected the familiar deck lights, the ready crews, the ordered chaos of recovery. Instead, an eerie silence permeated the airwaves, a stark contrast to the earlier cacophony of battle. Their initial reports from the morning, dismissed by some as overly cautious, had spoken of American scout planes, single aircraft, distant but undeniably present. These were not the massed formations of bombers, but the solitary, persistent eyes of the enemy, probing, searching. The established doctrine, honed through years of unchallenged supremacy, had emphasized offensive striking power, a decisive blow. Defensive reconnaissance, while acknowledged, often took a secondary role, its findings sometimes relegated to the periphery of immediate operational planning. Damage reports from the preceding days, meticulously filed but perhaps not fully synthesized, had indicated an increasing frequency of American patrol flights in the general vicinity. These were not direct threats, but rather the quiet accumulation of intelligence, the slow tightening of a net. Production logs from Kure Naval Arsenal and Yokosuka Air Group records showed a consistent output of reconnaissance aircraft, but their deployment and integration into the broader defensive screen were often subject to the more immediate demands of offensive strike packages. The strategic implication was a subtle but profound shift in the nature of the engagement, from a duel of concentrated forces to a broader, more distributed contest for information. The surviving pilots, many of them veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids, began to piece together the fragments of their experience. The scout planes they had seen, the ones their own command had seemingly disregarded, were not isolated incidents. They were the harbingers of a coordinated attack, a testament to American persistence and their willingness to gamble on intelligence. The absence of their carriers was not an oversight. It was the chilling confirmation of a devastating success by an enemy who had seen what they had not. The stark reality of their situation began to settle in. Their fuel was critically low, their ammunition spent, and their primary recovery platforms, the very heart of their naval air power, were gone. The vast, indifferent ocean stretched beneath them, offering no solace, no refuge. The silence from the radio was not a technical malfunction. It was the definitive answer to their unspoken questions, a final, unyielding verdict. The immediate aftermath of the carrier losses at Midway rippled through the Japanese naval air arm with a disorienting force. Pilots returning to empty stretches of ocean or to the stark recognition that their assigned deck was no longer a viable landing platform, faced a sudden, brutal reevaluation of their operational reality. The tactical doctrine, which had until then prioritized aggressive pursuit and engagement, now confronted a void where its logistical foundation had once stood. Damage reports and after-action assessments, compiled in the days following the battle, painted a grim picture of the remaining air assets. Of the 248 aircraft launched from the 4 carriers, only 100 were recovered by other vessels or survived ditching. This represented a 60% attrition rate for the strike force alone, excluding the inherent losses sustained by the carrier-based fighter screens. The loss of 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, represented a catastrophic reduction in the Imperial Japanese Navy's offensive projection capability. These vessels had collectively contributed 40% of the total carrier tonnage and 35% of the operational aircraft complement of the First Air Fleet. Their absence created a strategic vacuum that could not be filled by the remaining 2 fleet carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, or the smaller light carriers. Interrogation files from captured Japanese aircrew later revealed a profound psychological impact. Pilots, trained in an environment of seemingly endless resources and an almost unbroken string of victories, struggled to reconcile the sudden, comprehensive nature of the defeat. The concept of an entire carrier group being erased from the order of battle within a single day was, for many, an unthinkable outcome. Production logs from Mitsubishi and Aichi, reviewed in the subsequent months, showed a frantic but ultimately insufficient effort to replace the lost aircraft. While production lines were already operating at maximum capacity, the manufacturing lead times for new Zero fighters, Val dive bombers, and Kate torpedo planes meant that the immediate shortfall in experienced airframes could not be quickly overcome. A new Zero took approximately 18,000 man-hours to construct, a process that could not be significantly accelerated without compromising quality. The most critical loss, however, was not the steel of the ships or the aluminum of the aircraft, but the irreplaceable cadre of highly trained and experienced aircrews. The First Air Fleet had represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval aviation, its pilots having honed their skills over years of rigorous training and combat in China and across the Pacific. Their specialized knowledge, particularly in coordinated carrier-based strikes, was a finite resource. The immediate operational directive from Naval General Staff, issued within 72 hours of the battle's conclusion, mandated a defensive posture for the remaining fleet. This marked a stark departure from the aggressive expansionist strategy that had characterized the war to that point. The Imperial Japanese Navy, for the first time in the war, found itself reacting to enemy movements rather than dictating them. The silence from the once vibrant radio channels, previously alive with the chatter of flight leaders and spotters, became a pervasive symbol of the defeat. The absence of return signals, the lack of confirmation, and the chilling realization that no one was answering left an indelible mark on those who survived. The loss at Midway and the subsequent attrition of experienced air crews forced a profound reevaluation within the Imperial Japanese Navy. The initial reports from surviving pilots and carrier staff, often contradictory and emotionally charged, slowly coalesced into a grim consensus. The previously unassailable doctrine of overwhelming offensive air power, delivered with audacious precision, had encountered a new, unforgiving reality. The strategic implications rippled through every level of naval planning, from aircraft design to pilot training. Prior to Midway, the emphasis had been almost exclusively on offensive capability, speed, maneuverability, and powerful armament. Defensive considerations, particularly for carrier-based aircraft, were often secondary. The Zero, while an exceptional dogfighter, proved vulnerable to concentrated anti-aircraft fire and the sustained attacks of American dive bombers once its carriers were located and engaged. Damage reports from the Akagi and Kaga detailed catastrophic fires fueled by aviation gasoline and unsecured ordnance, highlighting systemic vulnerabilities in carrier design and damage control protocols that had been overlooked in the pursuit of pure striking power. Naval production logs from 1943 onward show a distinct shift in priorities. While Zero production continued, there was an accelerated development of more robust armored aircraft, such as the A6M5, which incorporated self-sealing fuel tanks and some degree of cockpit protection. The Nakajima B-6N Tenzan torpedo bomber, entering service in late 1943, featured a heavier airframe and improved defensive armament compared to its predecessor, the B-5N Kate. This represented a tacit admission that future engagements would not always permit the luxury of unchallenged offensive strikes. The training regimen for new pilots also underwent significant, if belated, modifications. The pre-war emphasis on individual skill and aggressive tactics, honed through years of rigorous selection and combat experience in China, had fostered a culture of daring but often inflexible air combat. Post-Midway, training manuals began to incorporate more explicit instructions on coordinated defensive maneuvers, evasive action, and the critical importance of maintaining situational awareness, particularly regarding the disposition of friendly forces. This was a stark contrast to the earlier ethos, which often prioritized the pursuit of enemy aircraft above all else. The strategic planners at the Naval General Staff grappled with the realization that their carrier fleet, once the spearhead of their expansion, was now a high-value target requiring increasingly elaborate protection. Escort doctrine evolved, with a greater number of destroyers and cruisers assigned to anti-aircraft screening duties. The development of radar, though lagging behind Allied capabilities, received urgent priority as the need for early detection of incoming threats became paramount. The era of the lone, unchallenged scout plane recording back to an unmolested carrier group was over. The long-term consequence was a gradual but irreversible shift from an offensive dominant naval strategy to one increasingly focused on defense and attrition. The confidence that had underpinned the early successes of the war eroded, replaced by a growing awareness of the overwhelming industrial capacity of the United States and the resilience of its forces. The battles that followed, from the Eastern Solomons to the Philippine Sea, would see Japanese carriers fighting not to decisively defeat an enemy fleet, but increasingly to survive against a numerically and technologically superior adversary. The silence from the carriers at Midway had been a harbinger, a quiet but profound signal of a future where strategic initiative would increasingly belong to others. The American submarines, their hydrophones straining through the vast Pacific, provided the first whispers of the Japanese fleet's approach. These submerged sentinels, often operating for weeks in enemy waters, were not merely torpedo platforms. Their primary mission in the days leading up to the decisive engagement had shifted to reconnaissance. Patrol reports, meticulously logged and transmitted in bursts, detailed sightings of smoke plumes on the horizon, changes in course, and the estimated speeds of distant formations. Each observation, no matter how fleeting, was relayed back to Pearl Harbor, then forwarded to the command centers where intelligence officers painstakingly pieced together the puzzle. The submarine USS Nautilus, for instance, reported a large convoy of transports escorted by destroyers on June 13, 1942, providing a crucial early warning of the invasion force heading towards Midway. These reports, often fragmented and subject to interpretation, formed the bedrock of the American understanding of Japanese intentions. Photo reconnaissance flights, launched from Midway Atoll itself, supplemented the submarine intelligence. Consolidated PBY Catalinas, slow and vulnerable, flew expansive search patterns, their crews scanning the endless expanse of ocean for any sign of the enemy. Their range and endurance were critical, allowing them to cover vast areas that surface ships could not, pushing the reconnaissance perimeter hundreds of miles from the island. The photographs brought back by these aircraft, often blurry and taken from high altitudes to avoid interception, were scrutinized by analysts. They identified ship types, estimated numbers, and discerned the composition of various task forces. A single image of a carrier deck, even with indistinct shapes, could confirm the presence of specific aircraft types, hinting at the operational readiness and air-wing strength of the enemy. Radio intelligence, however, proved to be the most potent weapon in the unseen battle. American cryptanalysts, having broken significant portions of the Japanese naval code, JN-25B, intercepted and deciphered a torrent of communications. These intercepts, often fragmentary and requiring immense deductive skill to reconstruct, revealed operational plans, unit designations, and even specific sailing orders. The volume of traffic alone provided clues. A sudden increase in radio transmissions from a particular sector or a shift in the types of messages being sent could indicate an impending movement or a change in strategic focus. These raw intercepts, labeled with their time and frequency, were then cross-referenced with submarine sightings and aerial photographs, building an increasingly comprehensive picture of the Japanese fleet's disposition. The intelligence section at SINCPAC headquarters, a hive of activity, processed thousands of these data points daily. Each decoded message, each sighting report, each photographic detail was entered into a master plot, a constantly evolving representation of the enemy's movements and intentions. The sheer scale of this effort, involving hundreds of personnel working around the clock, transformed raw data into actionable intelligence. This meticulous compilation allowed American command to anticipate the Japanese attack on Midway with remarkable accuracy. They knew not only that an attack was coming, but also the approximate timing and the composition of the main carrier strike force. This foreknowledge, gleaned from countless hours of unseen labor, provided the crucial advantage that would dictate the course of the coming engagement. The silence from the radio rooms, once a cacophony of urgent reports and tactical directives, settled into a stark, unambiguous void. This absence of response was not merely a breakdown in communication. It represented the physical disintegration of the very platforms that had launched and recovered these aircraft. The carriers, once the spearhead of imperial expansion, were now submerged hulks or burning wrecks, their operational capacity irrevocably diminished. The strategic implications rippled through every level of command, from the flight deck to the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. The loss of these vital capital ships, often in rapid succession, fundamentally altered the calculus of naval power in the Pacific. Prior to these engagements, the combined fleet had possessed a formidable numerical advantage in carrier-borne aircraft and the vessels to deploy them. Post-Midway and subsequent engagements, that advantage evaporated, replaced by a growing deficit that no amount of pilot training or aircraft production could readily overcome. The industrial capacity of Japan, while significant, could not match the accelerated output of American shipyards, which were now launching new carriers at a rate unprecedented in naval history. Production logs from the Kure Naval Arsenal and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries reveal a desperate acceleration in aircraft manufacturing, with monthly output figures climbing steadily through 1943 and into 1944. However, these new airframes often lacked the experienced pilots to fly them and the fuel to train them adequately or to deploy them in sustained operations. The attrition of seasoned air crews, particularly after the Solomon Islands campaign and the Battle of the Philippine Sea, proved irreparable. The average flight hours of a newly commissioned Japanese naval aviator plummeted from over 300 in 1941 to less than 100 by late 1944, according to training records. This qualitative decline in pilot proficiency was exacerbated by the increasing sophistication of Allied air defense systems and fighter aircraft. The F-6F Hellcat, introduced in 1943, consistently outmaneuvered and outgunned the A-6M0. Its superior climb rate, dive speed, and armament proving decisive in countless engagements. Damage reports from downed Japanese aircraft frequently cited multiple hits from heavy machine guns, indicating the Hellcat's formidable firepower. The technological gap, once narrow, widened into an unbridgeable chasm. The strategic initiative, once firmly held by the Imperial Japanese Navy, passed decisively to the Allied forces. Operations that had once been conceived as offensive thrusts into enemy territory were now desperate defensive maneuvers aimed at holding dwindling island strongholds. The vast distances of the Pacific, which Japan had once exploited to its advantage, now became a logistical nightmare, stretching supply lines to their breaking point, while American forces advanced inexorably, island by island. The absence of carrier responses thus marked more than just a tactical defeat. It signified the irreversible shift in the balance of power, a transformation from offensive capability to a protracted, ultimately unsustainable defense. The echoes of that silence resonated across the ocean, a harbinger of the inevitable. By the end of 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 10 fleet carriers, according to official naval records, effectively dismantling its offensive carrier air arm.